Okay, my name's Gary Francis. I'm doing a presentation tonight on Wicking Bed Gardening, taking people through what's it all about, how do you do it, what have you got to look out for as you're building these things and how to maintain them. And without further ado, as you can see on the screen in front of you, here is the water table of the earth. And a wicking bed is a water table, exactly the same as this. I've just added this into this presentation new tonight to try and take the mystery out of what a wicking bed is. What you're actually doing when you make a wicking bed is you're copying, funny this, right? We're copying nature, and we're presenting to, in this photograph, we're presenting to the trees water for them to take up through the roots by having water available under the soil. And nature's been doing this for a little while, right? But wicking bed gardening, what we're doing is copying this. So I'm hoping this will make sense. And how we are copying that is, let's just get that away a little bit, is here is a container that holds water. So we've got water and sand down the bottom, so it's exactly like Mother Earth. And we've got growing substrate above it, just like Mother Earth. So wicking beds, what we're actually doing probably in some ways is getting back to growing the way nature does, with a number of benefits, especially for people in Australia. A wicking bed itself can be any container that holds water. So you can make a wicking bed and have it on a veranda, in a bucket, literally just in a simple bucket from a hardware shop. You could use a big painter's pail. You can use anything that you could put a waterproof liner into, like a hard rubber liner, and just pack that around the edges of your container. Or as I've done in my backyard, I've used containers called IBCs. And that's what I'm showing in this graphic here, is a sort of a cutaway section of an IBC, and I'll show you what one of those looks like in a second. But a wicking bed is no more complicated than copying what nature does. As you can see, we've got soil up here, we've got soil up here, we've got water underneath the soil, we've got water underneath the soil. So I'm really hoping that this little slide here helps people understand that you're doing nothing other than copying what nature's already done. So here you'll see what people have put in as a pump for getting the water out of the soil. We're actually going to be putting water in using a pipe into the bottom, because we don't need to water the top of a wicking bed garden, because the water's wicking up through the soil exactly the same as nature. But instead of water coming up that pipe, we're actually putting our garden hose in there, filling up the sand that is below the soil to the height of the outflow, so it can never get higher, otherwise you can oversaturate your soil with water. And we're basically copying nature. The only thing this graphic doesn't show is like a weed mat, some sort of separating mat, so that you're separating your soil from the sand. It was just going to get too complicated to try and put that graphic in. So I use a weed mat, which sort of contains the soil, keeps the soil separated right across the surface of the sand and up the other side, just to stop the soil sort of making all the sand and water go sour, and vice versa. So I'm really hoping, because that's something I just built today, I'm really hoping that sort of makes sense and makes it far more simple. So, and this is what I said about jumping around things, right? What I've used and what I'm about to show you are these things here. Now, there are thousands of these lying in farmers' paddocks all over this country. Probably a lot of them not really used anymore. And the bizarre thing in Australia is the legislation says if you import, let's say, olives from somewhere internationally in one of these things, which is what they do get used for, food, chemicals, all sorts of liquid things, you can no longer use this container anymore. So in Australia, these become single-use appliances. So we think we're throwing away coffee cups, and that's pretty horrendous. It's bizarre that no one's ever made a car wash system to clean these things out so they can be reused. So it's the ultimate waste of really, really good containers. So this obviously stores liquid, so it sort of makes an ideal container for making your wicking bed garden. So all of my conversation this evening is going to be about using these things. Now, let me get the right PDF file up for us, which is that one. What I'm going to do is jump between these. This was a document I created because I was out physically doing training courses on this for people, and just trying to help people understand the advantages of this. And I'd start with these opening notes, even on my own notes. Once this type of system is up and running, to me, it's probably the laziest form of gardening there is. And there's a number of reasons for that. But primarily what you're doing is lifting your soil where the plants are growing to waist height. So you end up in a no bending garden situation. So if I have guests at my place and we're out talking in the garden, they start to weed because the soil's at waist height and they can see what weeds are, right? And even when we're talking, because the soil's now up off the ground, people start to weed in here. For Australians, the big advantage with these things is the water conservation. You're not watering the top of your soil anymore. You're actually filling up the water table under the soil. If you remember that graphic I gave you about how the earth works, you're putting water in under the soil and allowing it to wick straight up. So in Australia, of course, that means that we're ending up with tremendous efficiency on not wasting water to evaporation in the top of the soil if you're watering from the top with a hose. So really easy once you've got them established, quite lazy because you've removed bending, really good on water, the use of water, and some fantastic things happen. Even on the really hot days in Australia, I've never seen my plants and wicking beds wilt and suffer, because if it's a really, really hot day, they just wick, they draw up more water from the water reservoir below them. So even on the really, really hot days, my plants don't get stressed. And they take from the water that's available in the soil what they need. The rest of it, of course, does evaporate eventually through the soil. But on the way, it's really efficient in keeping your plants well watered. So on really, really hot summer periods in Australia, I'll only be filling up my wicking beds probably once a week. So I'm not even out there watering during the day anymore. I can leave them alone for up to about 7 days. Probably in the really, really hot summer days, it's down to about 5 days before filling up the containers again. But you're not out there every day anymore, and the plants, they just love it. And one question I was asked a lot of, what can I grow in a wicking bed? Well, it's soil. So whatever grows in soil, you can literally grow in a wicking bed. There's a little bit of limitation with things like trees, although you could do it if you've set it up properly. But everything you'd normally grow in a garden for food, you can grow in a wicking bed. Some of the considerations: make sure everything's level and strong. Consider your finished soil height. I can share with you how I got kind of caught with that a little bit. You've got to make sure that your water flow and the outflow is up and working and doesn't get clogged. And I'll share how you do that as part of what I'm presenting tonight. And you've just got to be a little bit careful about sand height in the bottom of the wicking bed against the soil height. But again, that's what this training is all about. Are there any questions before I sort of jump in? No? Okay. Let me roll forward then. One thing I saw once on Facebook was a lady who was using these, and she'd put the IBC up on 4 individual stacks of bricks, and she had that up about 2 or 3 feet high. No structural integrity whatsoever, and it's great when the container was empty, but you're about to put half a ton of weight into that container. These things each weigh at least half a ton when they're full of water and soil and sand. You have to make sure that they are put on something very stable. They will freestand themselves on the ground, of course, but as I'll work through this presentation, you'll see I've put all of mine onto pallets, and that gives you adjustability of your finished height of your soil, because you can use 1, 2, 3, or 4 pallets underneath them, and obviously pallets are quite strong. And as you'll see, I started using timber pellets, but then I found a company that would give me their plastic pellets, and again, that nobody wants their plastic pellets back, so I've sort of recycled the plastic pellets and put them under my wicking bed gardening. So, without further ado, let's get into the guts of how I've used mine and some of the do's and don'ts that I see around the place. So these are all IBCs, and obviously they have all been cut in half. Now, all it takes for that is a straight edge, a felt pen, and an angle grinder. And you can obviously cut anything you like with an angle grinder, and you're cutting a full container into 2 halves. So you end up with a top. This is a top because I can tell by the way the guy's done the plumbing. So this is the top of a container. That one there might be a bottom of a container. So out of one container, you get 2 opportunities. You double the soil size that you've got for your plants. But what I'd like people to take away from this page is how these ones have actually been cut. My ones that I've done here are here, and I'll explain to you how I did that in a second. This one here interests me because that plastic is very strong, but you could still lean over that and over time weaken the plastic. And if you filled that right up with soil to the top, of course, the plastic would start to bow out. So I wouldn't actually recommend that to anyone who wants to do this form of gardening, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. These ones here, a little bit better because the plastic is actually now supported by that metal rail around there, so the plastic's got some strength. Oh, and by the way, of course, having that amount of plastic exposed to the sun means that plastic's going to go brittle over time. But this one here is a bit better because he's cut it and left the plastic flush with the metal. So obviously the plastic's now being supported in a much better way. And these guys have done something similar to mine, and then they've had to come along and put all that foam on top so that, T-shirts and overalls and gardening clothes and your arms don't get scratched and skewered by those metal stakes. So before I did mine, I had a look at what everybody else is doing and went, no, I think I can do better than that. So what I ended up with was this. Now, what I've done is I've cut my IBC and left those uprights here in place. So I've left sharp bits of steel that are just sticking up into the air, unprotected. And I've obviously got 4 lots of those vertical bits of pipe per side on an IBC. What I've then done is come along and drilled big holes in my timber and slid this timber frame down over those rails. Oh, actually, on that one there, there's, 6 vertical poles on that one. So I've made a timber frame that holds itself there by just driving screws, as you would any picture frame, but it's all just sitting on top of those wooden metal spikes. So coming up to your IBC now, there's nothing sharp to be worried about. And I've got an opportunity here for affixing nails and screws and whatever else I want to use on my frame. And for me, this just made far more sense on protecting the plastic, getting rid of all the sharp steel, giving myself a place that I can just screw another piece of timber into. I could screw a coffee tray onto one of these things if I wanted to go out there and sit amongst my garden. And just having that extra fixing opportunity around the top of my IBCs, I love it. And I'll show you how I've used some of that later on. So before I go on, is there anyone who wants any questions answered now? Because I'm happy for this to be quite interactive.
Sorry, it's Crystal Art. Where do you get the IBCs from?
Fair call. Yes, very good. So I'd go and scrounge some off a farmer because it will save you the price. Where I live in Canberra. I've got a supplier that supplies them to me delivered at $120 each. And obviously that means that each of these halves is costing me $60. So there are companies out there trading in these containers because if they've been used for food, then they're a single-use item by Australian legislation. So companies are making an opportunity out of that, grabbing them from those suppliers, probably paying a little bit of money for them and on selling them. And your question also, thank you for asking questions because it triggers more answers from me as well. There are two types of these containers. There are food grade containers and non-food grade containers. You will pay more money for a food grade container, which means that it's only had food in it, not chemicals. All of the ones that I've used are non-food grade simply because they were cheaper. But what I did with them is I cut them in half. I washed them out thoroughly with proper dishwashing liquid and those sort of things. And then I let them sit outside for 3 or 4 weeks before I started to use them and just let all of the bad chemical get out of the container, so to speak. So I'm using non-food grade ones. They're $120 supplied by my local supplier in this town. But if depending on where you are, if you just go out driving to farmers' paddocks and things, and they're all over the place. I bet you can find some that actually wouldn't cost you any other money than to take them away. But there will be some.
Sorry, Gary, we're not far from Monbach, so I dare say there's a few floating up there, floating around up there.
Yeah, I was trying to think of those areas because I actually know Melbourne pretty good. But yeah, so you can save yourself money obviously by doing that. My ones cost me $120 each, and it was just convenient to have them delivered to my door, I suppose, as well. So sitting on pellets. I wasn't using plastic pellets here by the looks of things, but I've actually swapped all these out after these photos were taken and made them plastic. The plastic pellets don't cost me anything, nor do timber pellets, because there's a lot of companies that want to get rid of their timber pellets, and there's a lot of companies that are not interested in taking the pellet back once it's been used. You can't get hold of the really good pellets like this blue one here because with treated timber in them, because they do want those ones back. They're much higher cost, but you shouldn't have to pay a cent other than to pick up your pellets from wherever you can find them and bring them home. So the cost of the pellets, plastic or timber, should be free to you. You've just got to go hunting a little bit. I've used 2 pellets underneath my ones because at that stage on my back lawn, 2 pellets put the soil height. I actually fill mine right up now. You'll see my ones shortly, a lot more fill of soil than this one here is in the photograph. In hindsight, I probably should have used 3 because as you'll see in my photographs, I then came along and made a whole bunch of stone paths and things, and I raised the walking height by about 150 mil, which meant when you're walking past these, of course, they're now a little bit lower because you're obviously walking a little bit higher. So if I'd really thought about that, I probably would have used 3, to be honest. There's nothing uncomfortable about the soil height on my ones, but they're just that little bit lower than they were before I put the paths in. So free pellets, tick, tick, tick. If you can get hold of the free IBCs, tick, tick, tick. The only thing then you're paying for to get this far is the timber to make the frame around the top and the plastic piping. Now, you've got an IBC, you've cut it in half, but you need to install draining, especially into the lid, because obviously the lid was never designed for this application. And as we showed you in that first graphic, the outflow of water is absolutely critical out of these things. So you need to go to your local hardware supplier and buy plumbing bits like these ones here that I've used and put into these training notes. And incidentally, I'll send these training notes out to participants. So if you want a copy of even these notes, I'm more than happy to send them to you. Please just send me a private message and I'll send them out to you. So your lid, you need to install some drainage. There's obviously a tap in the bottom of the bottom of the IBC. So that's already sitting there waiting for you to take advantage of it. So does that make sense? And I'll show you how this comes together in some photographs very shortly. But hopefully that makes sense. This is a lid, right? So this has been cut in half and I've pulled it out of the metal frame. And all of the top of the IBCs have this recess in them, which I'm trying to show here on this photo. Now, if you can imagine this upside down, full of half a ton of sand, soil, and water, that's going to put tremendous pressure on that recessed, molded part of plastic. I would say it would probably crack and fail within 2 or 3 months of being loaded. So when you use the lid upside down, it's really important, I believe anyway, which is what I've done to mine, to pack this recessed area out with timber. And I've just used some more pallet wood, to be honest, cut to roughly about the right length. And as this lid is upside down, that timber is in between the pallet and that recessed part of the IBC, which obviously, hopefully means that the plastic isn't putting up with too much pressure from the soil. It's being transferred into the timber. And hopefully that makes sense, right? Because if you put half a ton on that recess or half a ton even on the big screw lid that these things come with, it's going to go all bad reasonably quickly. And I use a lot of silicone sealer on my lids too, because obviously you're trying to make sure that you get no water leaks out of these things. So I liberally apply silicone sealers and things when I'm doing that. Okay, so before, when we started, I showed you that pumping out the water from under the soil, and I said there was a pipe now to feed water actually in to the bottom of the IBCs. I've used 100 mil PVC piping. There are a lot of people out there using the black, very flexible, rolled up drainage piping. I don't like that, and I can explain to you why now, because I got some things wrong, and consequently I have to dig out every one of these containers and refill them. So what actually goes wrong for me in the black drainage pipe, that flexible pipe stuff that's got all the holes in it, people use that in wicking beds. I would stay away from that. The reason is I got this initially very wrong in my garden, and I had to dig all of the IBCs out. And over time, what happens is the sand, the very, very, very fine granules in the sand, they make their way to the bottom of the container, and it goes almost like clay because the granules are very, very small, and it goes almost like a bench top of marble, like a kitchen bench top. Now, if you've got your black water pipe at the bottom, that very, very fine sand is going to make its way into that black water pipe and effectively choke that pipe, which is going to make filling up the IBC a much more slow thing to do than if you use rigid pipe like this. But this 100 mil pipe is not cheap. The 90 mil pipe from the hardware store is probably about a quarter, well, maybe a third cheaper than 100 mil. But I used 100 mil because you can actually just get your sprinkler head of your hose and put it in the pipe and walk away until it's full. So those holes there, I've drilled there to make sure that when I'm filling up, the water is coming into the bottom of that pipe and making its way into the bottom of the IBC, obviously as in the absolute bottom of the container as possible. And I've cut the photo off there a bit, but you'd put your hose in here to fill that up, right? So the water's going to make its way through all here, leach out of all of those holes, and start creating that water table below your soil. Now, the thing you don't want to have happen over time is you don't want anything to puncture this plastic. So to give myself some buffer, because I do use sand and stones in mine, and having dug them out, the stones I think are a lot better. But you don't want stones and things up in close contact with that plastic, because over time it is going to put a lot of point pressure into the plastic, and that obviously risks puncturing the plastic. So I fill up the bottom of my IBCs to about that 100 mil before I start putting stones and sand in there. And I do the same when I'm filling them up around the sides. I put about 100 mil of sand between the stones and sand and pure sand and the side of the plastic. And it's all about trying to protect from getting that plastic punctured. Because you're digging out, to fix these things, you're digging out half a ton at a time. So put it all in there, puncture a hole, 12 months later, you're pulling out another half a ton, fix it. So you've got a ton already, then you've got to refill it. So you've just moved a ton and a half because you weren't careful about protecting your IBC plastic. So if in doubt, protect everything with sand. And the reason I now use sand and soil to fill these up, and I'll show you a photo of what they look like fill in a second, is when I dug them out, just having sand, it actually goes hard and packs down, obviously, with the weight from the soil above, and it makes it tending to be really slow and being porous. So I use like 10 or 15 mil round gravel and mix that with the sand as I'm filling the IBC, which will give the water an easier path through the sand. So I don't use just sand. I do use sand around the outside to protect the IBC, and I use sand and gravel in the sort of center as I'm filling it up to try and give the water an easier path through the sand. Any questions up till now? No? Okay. I'll just see where my photos are. Sorry?
A question from me.
Yeah, sure.
What sand do you use? Because there's different types of sand. Do you use a coarse river sand?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's fine. Please feel free, because that's the only way you guys are going to learn what I'm not covering is to ask me the questions. So please feel free. I'm not using, so the sand individual grains are quite small, so hopefully the puncture risk to the IBC's low, but obviously the water path through the sand is easier because the sand granules are a little bit larger. I wouldn't use sand that looks like talcum powder or anything like that, because it's going to pack harder than a granite bench top over time, and obviously the water isn't just, it's going to go like clay. It's going to be almost non-porous completely. So you want to think about the size of the sand that you're using there, the grains of sand, and don't go too small with them. And when I made these notes, there's been all sorts of studies about what works best. Do some research and see how you feel about what I've done. You might prefer something else, and that's okay. Now, carrying on a little bit, I'm starting to fill up the IBC now. And what I'm just showing you here is protecting the water pickup from inside the IBC by that piping hardware to create the outflow. I'm just using a porous sack full of stones, packing that around where the water is going to flow out through that piping, because I'm trying to keep the outflow as open as possible. The last thing you want to have happen in something like a really heavy downpour is the outflow couldn't tolerate the inflow and you end up flooding your IBC. Of course, it's going to drain over time, but you really don't want to get your soil to the point where it's starting to turn into peat, which is what I did, and promptly moved about 24 cubic meters of soil in and out again, or out and in. So making sure you've got good outflow on your water, your outflow is important. And the way I decided to protect mine was a sack full of stones packed nicely around the outflow. And if I just quickly jump to the photographs, that's what I tried to capture in these photos here. That's the outflow we were up to. That's what they look like. And I thought I had a couple of photos in here of outflow water. So I'll show you that in a second. But those are obviously high resolution or more detailed photos of the same thing I've used in the notes. Let me just jump back to my notes again. So protect the outflow and test it. Before you fill it up with soil, fill up your IBC with water and test it. Make sure you've got a good flow of water out of the thing. And that's what I was talking about with the stones, right? So that looks like I've just used sand to fill that, but that's actually like an earth-filled dam, sand around the outside, sand and stones filling up the center, the core of the IBC, again, to try and give that water an easy path through all the sand grains and sand itself. And there's me testing the outflow. I'm also testing at that stage how level the IBC actually is. So before I put the soil in, I do actually test the outflow. And obviously water self-levels. So if you really want to know that your sand is level, fill it up with water. That'll tell you straight away. Now, that's not a really good photo, but what it's showing you is that I'm only leaving about 150 millimeters for soil. And people go, crikey, that's not deep enough, right? But it actually is. And if you go too deep with your soil, like you go up to say 300 or 400 millimeters, what you're actually doing is starting to inhibit the wicking effect of these gardens. Because I suppose it's like a siphon or something like that. You can only draw the water up to a certain height before it doesn't work anymore. And all of your summer vegetables, zucchinis, pumpkins, tomatoes, cabbages, lettuces, broccoli, and all of those things, they don't have deep root systems. They're not looking to try and punch their roots down 500 millimeters for them to be effective growers. So you actually don't need a lot of soil in these things. And to a degree, the shallower the soil, sometimes the better, because it makes the wicking happen even faster. So if you've got a crop that was quite water hungry, perhaps like maybe corn, you'd probably, I wouldn't go more than about 150 millimeters for corn. So you're not looking to use a heck of a lot of soil at the top. And that helps you, frankly, keep the soil composted and everything else. You're not trying to dig down 500 mils of soil and refresh that amount of, that depth of soil with compost. So you only use quite a surprisingly shallow amount of soil. Now, the only photograph that I missed taking when I was taking this range of photographs is me putting in a weed map, because now I've got my sand to around about the right height. The next thing to do here is to lay the weed map in, and I do mine like the bottom of a tent, so it goes across the top of the sand and up the sides of the IBC, and I use one that's got a bit of a felt covering at the back of it, which my logic for buying that one, which wasn't the cheapest, was the felt's going to act like a moisture transfer thing as well. So I apologise, the only photo I didn't take here was filling that up with the weed mat. And that's, I've mentioned it here, but I didn't have a photograph of it, sadly. Just one that I forgot. And look at that, I've even Australianised my notes by using Bunnings. So my pipe is installed. You saw that from the beginning. That's my water hose pipe. So going back to that first graphic I used, I'm going to use that opposite than using a water pump to get the water out of my environment. I'm going to actually use that pipe to put water into the bottom of my IBC. I've then put the weed mat into this thing and started filling it up with soil. And here's what I've learned over time. Any soil in a pot is going to go rock hard eventually. And these containers, whilst they're big containers, you're effectively using them as a pot. So I use in my soil a lot of this white vermiculite. And if you want to write that down, you can. I don't think it's actually, oh, no, I have. I've included it. I use vermiculite. You can get vermiculite or perlite. I much prefer vermiculite. And that's all about keeping the moisture in the soil, but it's also about keeping the soil fluffy, so the roots don't get a hard time trying to go down through the soil. So I use a lot of vermiculite when I'm filling these up. And I'll also show you, I found a cocoa product that they're actually grinding the husks of coconuts down and that's really good for water conservation as well. And I put a fair bit of that into my soil as well. So just remember, over time, the soil's going to go hard. So you want to make sure your soil's as light and fluffy as possible. And for putting in compost and all that sort of stuff, the lighter your soil, the easier it is to dig it over later anyway. So there's many advantages with trying to make your soil quite soft. I'm just reading those notes down there at the moment as well. Vermiculite, yeah, a big bag, 100-litre bag's $50, and I'd use probably half a bag in each one. So my $50 would do 2 of these containers, and it's just I prefer to have the soil far more loose than packing down, going hard. Filling all the way. Yeah, this is now about where I take my soil height. So that's my timber frame that's been slotted onto those uprights. And I'm quite massively overfill my IBCs, and that's just allowing, and you can see the amount of vermiculite even in that photograph, right? There is a lot of vermiculite. It's like a really tiny, fine-grained pumice. That's what it feels like. It's very, very lightweight, keeps air and moisture very, very well. And you can see how much is actually in my soil, right? There's a lot. But I've filled this up way over the top, because even after the end of one summer, that will be flush or maybe slightly lower than the top of my timber frame. So don't be scared when you are filling these up of actually really overfilling the soil. It's quite surprising how much it packs down over time. And that allows it to settle. And in these training notes, and that's why I thought it might be easier to actually put this graphic up first. And this is maybe a time to ask questions before I move on. And I'm on page 7 of 12 here, so we're 2/3 of the way through this presentation. But this is hopefully now makes sense, right? That bag of gravel is actually wrong, because I'd have sand underneath that. I wouldn't even put that bag full of stones into the bottom of the IBC. But there's your water outflow. So obviously with a hacksaw, you can adjust the height of that outflow up or down. So you got to keep an eye on what's going on in your IBC and get your outflow about right. I have mine about 100 millimeters below the soil. So it wicks up through 100 millimeters of sand, goes through the porous membrane and then into the soil. And obviously that's my water pipe that I'm just sticking my hose in and letting it fill up until the outflow starts to pour water out, and then I go and fill the next one. So at this stage, I'm not finished the presentation, but I'm finished the how to cut them in half, put a frame on top of them, how to mount them on something that's strong, filling them up, making sure your outflow is okay, and putting soil in. So I've kind of already reached the end of, this is the end of what a wicking bed looks like, and how to fill it up and make it an effective growing platform. So are there any questions up to this stage?
Yes, hi Gary, it's Gypsy here.
Hi.
Just with the hi, how are you going? With the vermiculite,
Yep.
do you have to add that regularly?
No.
Obviously after the first installment of it to mix through the soil. Is it something then that you would just add on a regular basis to keep the soil fluffy, as you were saying?
Yeah. No. Yes and no. It seems to last pretty good. It obviously does break down in the soil, but mine, I'd probably get a couple of years out of mine before I need to add more.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, because it's like a pumice. It doesn't. It's actually superheated rock that kind of explodes like a popcorn, and then they break it all up into small flakes, right? So it does actually last a little while, but it does obviously deteriorate and gets absorbed back into the soil eventually. But I'll show you this other medium that I found as well, and I use a lot of this cocoa, ground up cocoa. I'll show you that. Please remind me if I don't. But no, vermiculite sort of doesn't just disappear in 3 months. It does actually stay in the soil for a reasonable period.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
That's all right. Has anybody else got anything else before I proceed? Okay, that's cool. cladding. Well, let me just jump to my photos as well, because I've had those prepared, right, and what just might help. So there we go. There's the IBC, my outflow, another pipe that I'm putting into that one. And by the way, I'm the reason I was able to take these photos is because I completely got this wrong for all of my IBC containers, and it meant that I have to dig out everything of these again, dig it all out, reset it all, and then put it all back in again. So each one of these containers and manual labor for me has been 1.5 tons of material moved in, out, and then back in again. So the reason I started taking these training courses is because I realized what my mistakes were and didn't want anybody else to have to do what I'd had to do. And I've still got about 5 of these to dig out this coming winter because I just got sick of doing it. But what is in these photographs? So there's part of my backyard. It's an urban block in the middle of an urban town in Australia. And there was my first go-round of IBCs into what was back lawn. My lawnmower sort of sits in my shed now and doesn't do a lot anymore. But just to give you a visual view, now these are the plastic pellets. I love these. They are super strong. They are never going to rot. They are never going to deteriorate. And yes, they're plastic and that's terrible, but people who supply goods on plastic pallets don't take the plastic pallets back. So their customer ends up with racks of these things lying around and they don't know what to do with them. So when I rock up with my trailer to take another 5 or 10 or 15 of these things away, they love me. So if you drive around your industrial suburbs where you are and try and find these plastic containers, I'd highly recommend them to you, because timber is eventually going to deteriorate, fall apart, rot, whatever. Plastic is never going to do that. And these are already produced, so the planet's already, paid the price of having them made. Well, here's a way of putting them to good use for long term. Just showing you some photos. So I'm a bloke and I can think ahead occasionally. When I did all of these, I put the filling pipes close together. So, how hard is it to lift up a hose from this pipe and plonk it in that one? The answer is obviously not very. So I thought about where my filling pipes were going to go just to make it, crazy easy to go and actually water my garden. So I'm watering 6 IBC halves there from only 3 locations, and I'm not struggling to try and find them when the plants grow up because I know that they're together in pairs. What I have done, which I didn't say before, when that pipe goes down along there and then down this wall here, my outflow is over here. So I am keeping the pipe away from the outflow, which then says for the outflow to actually flow out with water, the entire bottom of that IBC has been filled with water, because my inflow is as far away from the outflow as possible. So the outflow is only going to work when the water leaches across all of the sand at the bottom to then flow out. So what I didn't say before was that's what I do to make sure that the bottom of the IBC is being entirely filled. And in this photograph here, you can see my outflows there. They still aren't up far enough, and these IBCs, I filled them up all wrong originally, so I won't spend long on this, but just to show you what they look like when they're installed. This photograph here shows the cocoa that I'm using. It's ground up coconut husks, and it's really good stuff. And I buy it in compressed bricks. I fill up my wheelbarrow, I throw 1 brick into that wheelbarrow, and I actually have to twice fill the wheelbarrow with water for that brick to take up the water and start expanding. So I put a lot of this stuff on top of my soil, but I also put a lot of the stuff in the soil as well. Again, trying to keep the soil soft. So that's kind of what they look like. Obviously on day 1, no spider webs, no cobwebs, everything brand new, everything installed, and at this stage growing onions and other things in there at that time. I'll just see where my photos take me. That's sort of showing you the same thing. I put a lid on those outflows too. Snails and slugs love to get in those pipes because it's wet, doesn't dry out, it's dark. So if you want to encourage a lot of snails and things to come in, don't put a top on your pipe, and you'll come out here sometimes and there'll be 30 odd snails in one of these things. So I always put a lid on top of the inflow for where the water's going to go, just to keep the critters away. And that's one big advantage of this type of gardening too that I haven't really mentioned. I don't get the same influx of slugs and snails and all those critters, because climbing up the side of one of these things is a bit of a job for a small snail. So I typically don't see the same sort of predation by those sort of insects in the garden, because the soil's up high. You still get them, of course you do, because they want to survive and eat and live and thrive as well. But when I was growing on the ground, they got no work to do. They just come across and munch everything, right? Well, in this environment here, they've got a bit of a job to do to find food. So typically my crops don't get so beat up by particularly earwigs. Earwigs can be really destructive. I don't get so many earwigs because for some reason or other they can't figure out to come up and attack me at the soil. And there's an outflow. That's the photograph I was looking for before. I've obviously twisted that to the side to try and make it even pour out more. And it's a very bad photo, but there is a lot of water flowing out of that pipe. You want to make sure that your outflow indeed flows well. Photos. Right, now we'll go back to my notes. Not that one, this one. Yay. Cladding. So remember what I was talking about with the timber frame before? The fact that I've got that timber frame at the top of mine means I can screw things to it or nail things to it. And the reason I want to clad my IBC is because I'm keeping the sun off the plastic. They are UV fast plastic, so it's UV resistant, but it still breaks down over the time, right? Sunlight's really, really harsh. Funny that, for the amount of sunburn. So you want to protect the plastic from direct sunlight as much as possible. And the reason I decided to do the wooden frame thing here is because I'd already foreseen that the only way I could actually protect the plastic was to have something at height to be able to fix cladding to. So this is obviously Colorbond steel that I brought from the local junk shop, recycling place at the tip. Brought it home and screwed it through the timber. Whammo, I've got really cheap cladding that protects the IBC. This shows you another method, which was completely free. It's way more labor intensive. But what you're looking at there is I pulled apart, 40 or 50 pallets. I actually brought a tool to pull apart the pallets properly so you don't smash all of the pallet timber into bits when you're pulling them apart. Denailed them all, cut them all to size, re-nailed them all, and used those to clad my IBCs. It was time intensive, but you'll see shortly they look fantastic when they're oiled, but they were free because they're just the reuse of a timber pellet. So I've had to pay for that stuff, even, maybe $5 or something for that. But because I was getting my pellets for free at no cost. So even timber pellets, if you want to go this way, are effective for your wicking bed gardening because you can use them to clad the sides of your IBC. And you'll see shortly, I've gone to massive advantage using this amount of fixing surface for screws and nails and things. And obviously kept the cost down, but it is way more labor intensive. This took me forever to do these. Okay, so that's kind of like, I'll show you some photos of my garden in a minute, but that's kind of wicking beds done. And in these training notes, I just threw a budget at people. This was sort of, yellow note type budget, but it just gives you an idea of what each IBC. So this is now a half, right? So $60. Wash sand, that's what I was paying for wash sand for 3/4 of a meter. That's, $42 for 3/4 of a meter. And I'm using, about, probably about somewhere between a third to half a meter in each IBC. Well, it can't be half a meter, maybe about a third. So that $42 was probably even cheaper than that per IBC. Bit of membrane plastic. Like I said, the 100 mil piping is quite expensive. 90 mil is cheaper, but I'm lazy. You can stick the garden hose into a 100 mil pipe really easy, but it's a bit more hard to get your watering tap to stay in a 90 mil pipe. External plumbing fittings, that's for your outflow. Layer of topsoil, there's your vermiculite in there. So, $20 each one of those. Cladding, I put at 0 because I was using pellets. So that brought me to a total cost of about $200 for a half. Now, before people have a heart attack and die, if you get your pellets for free, you've got a source of secondhand timber for the frame. Your cladding you get for nothing because that's pellets as well. You've already got some topsoil lying around, and hands up any gardener that doesn't have a spare roll of weed mat lying around the place that was surplus. And you can very quickly, obviously, start dropping some of your costs away a great deal. So that they're not the cheapest thing to set up, I'd have to say, but for me, the water conservation aspect of them, big tick. The soil at the right height, big tick. The less bugs and things that get to your soil and therefore your crops, big tick. So I didn't mind paying to set my garden up with these things for all of those advantages. But if you can get your IBCs for free as well, then your major cost is the $60 is gone straight away. So please don't go and thieve them from nighttime, but you should be able to find some in your local area that won't cost you anything. I just got lazy and brought mine rather than driving around asking the farmers in the local area. So there's your budget. Let me just see what I've done with my photos. See where we go with those. That's the cladding that I was talking about. Cladding, and there's my garden. So the finished product can be quite interesting. Now, this is a little bit unfair as a photograph because what I'm actually showing you there is bunk beds. That's got nothing to do with IBCs. But I scored some bunk beds, and they're just perfect for growing raspberries because you've got the railing at the bottom to support the young shoots of the raspberries, and then they come up through the top meshing where the mattress would sit on top, and that gives them the perfect support up high. So I couldn't resist grabbing those bunk beds and using them for my raspberries. But these here is the wicking bed. You can tell by the cladding, and I've got mine at different heights to make the garden more interesting. And the level of my backyard wasn't level anyway, so I couldn't be bothered digging it out too much. And I just plonked the IBC on and leveled it up and started filling it up. So what does it look like as a finished product is this. Those vertical bits of steel that I brought to hold up all of that bird mesh, guess what? That's screwed to the top frame timber on the top of my IBC and screwed into the plastic pallet below. So if I didn't have that timber frame around the top of my IBCs, the stuff here that you can see in this photo, I wouldn't be able to do all this fancy stuff as well because I wouldn't have anywhere to be able to screw anything to. So I really like, when I sat down and thought about it, doing it the way that I decided to do it, because having that timber there, I've got an endless array of options of utilizing that timber, and that's part of it, right, was how I installed that metal framing. So nothing to do with IBC gardening, but the putting up the metal verticals and putting up all that bird mesh is super advantageous. The bees can still get through it, by the way. They work it out, they get in. But here's the finished product of what an IBC garden can look like. Now, see, I've installed that path there, right, those bricks, and that's what I was talking about. See the height of the first pellet? I've almost lost the total height of the first pellet to the path. If I'd thought about it better, I probably would have used 3 pellets, which would have lifted my soil height up even more. So just think about your finished height of where you want your soil. And if you're going to all the trouble of doing this, then getting that soil height, well into pelvis height is really good, because then you're not bending at all. So just have a think about it. When you oil that timber, boy, does it bring the garden up and make it look amazing. And all of this cladding is free. And please don't kill me, but I've used old sump oil on this timber from cars and motorbike oil, used oil. Rather than dumping it, I've actually let the timber drink it in like they used to in the old-fashioned days. That's what they had as a water treatment, was oil. So rather than dump mine at the tip, I started using it, and it stained all of the timber sidings of all of my IBC containers. And you can see in that photograph there, this is this, again, nothing to do with wicking beds per se, but water retention and keeping your soil soft and keeping the weeds down. I've used that cocoa stuff and spread that all over the top of the soil, because then you've virtually got no weeds. It's not quite true. Of course, nature's always going to grow through it, but it slows everything down really nicely. Yeah, and this is just a series of photos now of my backyard and what it actually looks like when it's finished. I even came up with nice fancy labeling, because my wife complained she could never find where anything was. So these tiles here are 90 cents each from Bunnings, and permanent marker pen. They wipe off with a bit of turpentine, and you've got a nice shiny surface, and you can write big labels so wives don't complain anymore when I remember to keep using them. Yep, excuse me. And that's what they look quite cool though. And all of your foods at waist height, all of the looking for bugs and caterpillars that have got in, because the white caterpillar moth still gets through that mesh a little bit. It obviously keeps their numbers down too, but it starts to look quite presentable for what used to be an unproductive back lawn. We've got a supermarket of food, and it's all at the right height, and it's all good water efficiency, and it's all less bugs, and it's all no bending. With the, that's obviously with the meshing wound up, with the meshing wound down, and obviously this has been some weeks or maybe a month or two later, you start looking at a pretty productive garden that's that close to my house that it's, you just walk out the backyard and you're in a food co-op really. But I've got two sections to my backyard. This is the back of my property, and this is what I did with the pathing and the wicking beds in the back of the property. And I've obviously put that all under bird mesh as well, I want to eat the fruit. Sorry, Mother Nature, but at this stage, this is about survival for me and my wife, and I covered the whole lot in bird mesh. But it starts to look quite nice, right? Paths down. You'll see here none of these plants are struggling. They're all getting enough water. They're all wicking the water up through the soil. And like I said, in the really hot summer days here, maybe a week of 35 degrees, I'll only fill those containers up probably every 5 days. And I don't need to water anything else. There's enough water in the bottom of the wicking beds that they'll last for a good 5, 6, 7 days before I need to put any more water to them at all. So, this is literally what my backyard looks like. Oh, I even left a can of fly spray. That was nice. And you'll see everything's just flourishing, right? Because they're getting the exact right amount of water they want, because it's wicking up past their roots. It's not trying to come down having evaporated from watering it from the top. To get your seedlings and things started, you need to spray the top, but it's only for the first 2-3 weeks, maybe maximum, until the roots sort of take into the soil and start drawing the water up from the bottom. But I've got food growing in my backyard right now today that I haven't watered for a week, and it's thriving because the water is being presented to the roots, not to the top of the soil where you lose it by evaporation. That's just another shot. These pipes around the outside, by the way, please don't get confused by that. I'm just using those as a slow drip watering for other plants that are in behind there. So you remember when I said I put these pipes close together just because I'm lazy? I built a water container out of that pipe and put the infill near the other IBC so I can stand there and do all three things at once. But you'll see here, right, nothing here is struggling. Everything's green, lush, and just taking off. That's raspberries, so you can't even see the bunk beds. I gave away kilos and kilos and kilos of raspberries this year. Just the raspberries went nuts. So, that's wicking bed gardening, folks. And beetroot, growing at the wrong time of the year, beetroot doesn't seem to mind it. And you'll see this is all covered in that crushed cocoa. But I will draw out, it's going to be part of my vertical gardening presentation. This photo will become part of that too. Because I've got that timber frame and that's sitting on really solid steel frame of the IBC, I'm able to put big sturdy planks where previously you wouldn't be able to grow anything, and put pots all along there too. And it's all because I've got that timber frame that I could take advantage of space even between the IBCs that wouldn't previously be available to me. Yeah, just a few more photos. That's it, I think. Yeah, this is on to other photos now. So this is more of my backyard and more that I'll present in later times. So, questions? Because I'm kind of out of material, fresh stuff to show you guys. Please fire away.
With the in one of your photos, then you showed what looked like blue plastic drums on their sides. What do you use those for?
Come next week and I'll tell you about them. No, no kidding around. I'll answer your question handsomely for you. Those are my compost bins, and what I'll present those to you next week when I show you vertical gardening is my compost system is vertical. So I'm maximising the space in my backyard by using every strategy I can to use vertical space. So I use a lot of shelving, you'll see here. Those are my compost bins, and I'll show you how to make those next week. They're sitting on an axle, so they turn and they spin. I even worked out a way of making that happen when they're full and really heavy. And there's my strawberry tower, which is literally called the strawberry tower, which again is using vertical space, because I ended up with a strange sort of area in my garden and went, how the heck do I use that? My answer when I'm thinking those questions, I'm always trying to answer it vertically. So I built a strawberry garden that was vertical in that space. But that's what I'll present next week, right? And I have gone crazy. My like we've named all the little pathways, the herb rack and Chevron way, and this thing here is called the herb rack. We just had some fun to try and make the garden a little bit intriguing. Sadly, now when my wife calls for me, I actually have to tell her which street I'm in. So she knows exactly where I am. I can't hide.
I was going to say, I really liked all the butterflies. I loved all the butterflies that you had.
Just make your garden interesting. Yeah, you just make it interesting. This street here is called, what's it called? It's not called Mystic Lane. It's called something like Gypsies and Fairies. And at here, you'll see the plank here that I've got spanning where you wouldn't previously be able to grow anything because you wouldn't be using the vertical height. I've got half of this plank this year filled with pots, and the other one's got fairies and little gnomes and all sorts of interesting things in there, just to make your garden a bit more alive, right? I don't think I've got a photo of all of that. But yeah, I've got butterflies, and both my wife and I don't mind some colour, and it just makes it more interesting. There's wind chimes everywhere, so my garden sings every day I'm out there. I've got about 6 sets of wind chimes, which will probably drive a lot of other people nuts.
It looks absolutely amazing, like completely blown away. Seriously, you've done such an amazing job, Gary.
Yeah, there's a bit of labour here too, of course, but I mean.
Well, you're reaping the benefits now, aren't you? After putting such a lot of hard effort into establishing it, and as you say, now you're reaping the benefits, and you've got a thriving, basically your own fruit and veg shop.
I do, and I've actually growing my own chemist shop as well, because as Jay will attest, I'm growing a wide variety of medicinal herbs as well. But that's part of next week's process too, because I've done that in a vertical way. So I've put that into the vertical gardening section now too. But once it's, there's a lot of work to do this. Yes, of course there is. There's a lot of work to establishing soil in any normal garden. But once you get it to this level here, it's the laziest gardening you can ever do because the soil's at waist height. You're not down on your hands and knees anymore, right?
That's good thinking, though. That's good. That's good planning. I really like that. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's the less kind of exertion you have to do later on, the better. And it's a great idea.
When my wife goes out to harvest for food, I actually catch her pulling some weeds out from time to time too, just because they happen to be at arm's length. It's kind of something that we do.
Yeah.
If you see a weed, you pull it. But if you've got those weeds down on the ground, no one's going to get down on their haunches or down their hands and knees to pull out weeds. But when the soil's at this height, even my wife, who is not a gardener, she'll sometimes pull out weeds when she's taking crops out of there, right? So it's once you get it to this stage, it's really lazy gardening because you're only watering once every 5 to 7 days. The bugs aren't there as much. Obviously, my bird meshing keeps a lot of other things out, but lets the bees in. You're talking about one of the laziest gardeners you can ever speak to, being me, because everything's now at waist height.
Yeah, that was a really interesting thing how you said about the snails and so forth, and obviously putting the lid on the pipe. But yeah, that's a really good. That's a bonus.
Yeah, well,
they don't want to climb up that high. They're lazy too.
They're lazy too, right? But see, I got lazy because pulling apart these pellets was taking me ages. There's a lot of work to do that, but it looks really good. I've got to say it looks better than the corrugated iron. But remember how you said I was using engine oil on here, which might make some people cringe. But if you go and spend good money at the local hardware shop, their stain doesn't last much more than a couple of years anyway. So I'd rather use what I was going to throw away. I've actually painted the back of that Colorbond steel with one strip of oil on it, so that if anything tries to climb up the back of that steel, it's going to hit, from its perspective, something it can't pass. So I've actually just done one brush stroke of oil on the back of that Colorbond before I actually screwed it to my timber frame, just to stop, any sneaky little e-wigs and things like that want to come up the profile of that Colorbond to get to the top. Wherever you see Colorbond, there has been one paintbrush thickness of oil put onto there, and that really stops the critters coming up and getting into the garden.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Well, you've certainly provided amazing instruction, Gary. Yeah, absolutely incredible presentation. Thank you so much.
That's all right. No problems at all. I've been doing a lot of research for a lot of years, like 20, 25 years, and something told me to do this about 6 years ago. And unfortunately, the reality is this becomes a massive advantage right now if the shops start running a little low.
Yep.
Do we really care that much? And I'm not saying that to show off. I'm saying that it feels fantastic not to be reliant on our economy and just-in-time delivery for all of the food that I'm consuming, right? The feeling of independence
Absolutely.
you have when you can have your own food is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely spot on.
And then you have fun, right? I'll just see if I can find the photo for you. This plant here, this is amaranth. Now, in Australia, amaranth is a weed. It's a toxic, noxious weed because it takes off if you let it run. The seeds from amaranth are 21% protein. Right? So if I want the tiny seeds, you'd have to turn my entire garden into an amaranth garden to get enough to make flour, but you can grind it and make flour with the stuff. But we go up there and shake these massive seed heads, and you end up with a tablespoon of seeds, and we just eat those straight raw. You just blow the other chaff off them and throw them in your mouth. That's 21% protein. And boy, the amaranth in those wicking beds, it just goes nuts. And you can get amaranth in 3 or 4 different colors, so it can look like a pretty flower. But it's a strong, very, very strong source of protein.
Okay.
So I grow it every year.
I suppose.
Sorry?
Could you add it to smoothies and that sort of stuff?
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And when we get to week 3 of my little gardening presentations, because week 3, next week will be vertical gardening, and you guys will be a little bit bored because you've seen these photos, but I'll take you through my garden from a vertical growing perspective and just show you the strategies that I goofed around with and play with today. And then the next one will be food storage. Well, amaranth is a dry seed. You can just dry it out. Don't need a fridge. It'll last forever, and it's 21% protein.
Awesome.
Yeah, there's nothing to do with Wicking Bed Gardening, of course, but anyway. So has anyone got any more questions? Because I'm happy to answer any question you'd like about gardening. But it comes up looking nice, so. So we go out there. I mean, this is a plum tree, just to show you the elegance of what you can do. We'll have lunch out here, and when it's in season, we'll reach up and grab a plum for dessert straight off the tree without even getting our lazy backsides up off those chairs, because that plum tree's not
Now I'm jealous. I'm totally jealous. That's not fair.
So, and the interesting thing with this, and it's just, I didn't plan this, this garden is completely hidden. You cannot see this from the street or anywhere else. You can see some prayer flags, but this entire garden is a secret garden in suburbia. You cannot see this from the street. None of it.
Incredible.
It's just an advantage my property location provided me. So 2 doors down don't know that I have this food source. My direct next door neighbours that I'm good friends with, they've come in and it's blown them away. But the net is, if people were around the streets desperate and I wanted to keep this quiet, you cannot see this from the road. Yeah, okay. Well, if we've finished with the questions, I'll turn the recording off and we'll call it a night, I suppose. But to anyone who wants the material from me, just send me a message, please, rather than try and join the mutual aid group, and I'll send you back the material directly. The last thing as a gift to you guys for putting up with me is this stuff here, lactobacillium. If you want to have food on steroids, I'm happy to share this with you. It's how to make this serum up, and you use such small quantity of it. Once you've made it once, you do not need to make it for a long time. It makes the roots of the plants just go nuts with the contact to the soil. So the plant itself grows much stronger, much more leafy, more abundant color, bigger vegetables from it. And it's all about this stuff here. And I'm happy to give this away to whoever wants it as well. It's a PDF document that tells you how to make the stuff and how to apply it. And it's a single page document. And if you didn't do anything else for your garden, using this stuff is like dumping the best compost ever into your soil. Your plants will just love you for it. So if you send me a message, I'll send you all of the training notes that I used to use, which is this document, and I'll send you the lactobacillus. And once I save this video file, I'll send you that as well. But please send me a message rather than joining the group, please.
Hey, I know how to spell it now.
Oh, you joined. Good on you.
Hello, Gypsy.
Hello, Alan.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just came in at the